The name is Bond. James Bond.
James Bond, North by North Korea. Prologue. The man in a convoy. The winter night was so cold it could have frozen a politician's smile, which in North Korea was saying something. A convoy of identical black trucks crawled across the snow-buried track, each one looking like it had been designed by someone who thought color was a Western conspiracy. The trucks bummed and rattled over potholes deep enough to hold small livestock. But whether livestock existed here was another matter entirely. Inside the rearmost truck sat 6 prisoners, chained together in a way that suggested whoever cuffed them had a strong grudge against elbows. One of the prisoners slumped casually, as if on the night bus to Croydon, was James Bond. His papers forged and laminated with a kind of enthusiasm only MI6 interns have said he was Mr. Hunt, a Singaporean arms broker. But Bond suspected the guards already knew he wasn't exactly local. His shoes were too clean, his posture too relaxed, and he had not once praised the Supreme Leader's haircut. That alone made him stand out. One guard eyed him suspiciously, then said something in Korean that Bond's basic language training translated loosely as, "Why is he smirking? Prisoners do not smirk." Bond smirked harder. It was partly nerves, partly habit, and partly because he had just realized the guard's head was both too big and too small at the same time, an impressive feat of millenary incompetence. The truck lurched violently as it hit a ditch, sending every prisoner into the air for a moment like synchronized swimmers who had taken a very wrong turn. Bond landed neatly, of course, while the guard fell into a metal toolbox with a satisfying clank.
"Careful," Bond murmured under his breath. "It's icy." He doubted the guard understood the words, but the tone carried, and Bond always enjoyed the little things.
Chapter 1. A Quiet Assignment. London was damp. That wasn't news. London was always damp. But this particular morning it seemed to be competing for a world record in soggy misery. Even the pigeons looked like they'd given up for life. Bond stepped into the lobby of MI6, shaking off the grey drizzle. The receptionist, a young man who always looked 2 coffees short of consciousness, gave Bond a polite damp nod. "Morning, sir." Bond nodded back. He had faced death, torture, and bureaucracy. The receptionist was by far the least threatening. M's office was upstairs, behind a door that opened with a resigned sigh of wood that had seen too many national crises. M stood by the window, staring out at the Thames as if waiting for it to confess something. His expression was that usual blend of irritation, exhaustion, and mild indigestion. On the desk lay a thin dossier. Project Kolyma.
"Morning 007, M said, in the tone of a man who had discovered his favorite restaurant now served only quinoa. "Do sit."
Bond sat. The chair was as unforgiving as ever. He suspected it was designed that way deliberately to discourage long meetings. M pinched the bridge of his nose. "We've received intelligence from the peninsula. North Korea, of course. It appears that they are working on something ambitious." "Ambitious as in nuclear?" Bond asked. "If only," M replied darkly. "That would almost be refreshing. No, this is something different. Something involving cybernetics, synthetic biology, and, God help us, artificial intelligence."
Bond raised an eyebrow.
"So they're upgrading from missiles to mechanical madness." M slid the dossier across. "Satellite images show a clandestine facility at Roysong. Rumors of cloning, body doubles, human-machine hybrids, and naturally they claim it's all part of a peaceful research initiative." Bond flipped through the photos, concrete buildings, antennas. men in hazmat suits. Cheerful stuff. "And I suppose," Bond said dryly, "you'd like me to go to North Korea, infiltrate their most secure facility, and politely ask what they're up to?" "Yes," M said, as if Bond had just read the lunch menu. "And try not to start a war. The press are still grumbling about the last one." Bond nodded. "I'll do my best, sir. Shall I bring back a souvenir?" "If you must," M said. "Try to avoid anything explosive or alive. And Bond, do try not to insult their government too directly." Bond stood. "I make no promise, sir." On the way out, M muttered, "North Korea. Why can't these maniacs ever take something harmless like pottery?" Chapter 2. Pyongyang Nights. Pyongyang, Bond decided, was like a theatre stage built by someone who'd only ever seen cities in propaganda posters. From the air it had looked almost normal. Streets, buildings, lights in neat geometric patterns. But as the plane descended, he'd noticed the odd stillness. Too few cars, too few people, too much empty space, carefully swept and obediently grey. Now, standing in the arrivals hall, he watched a series of enormous portraits glaring down at him from high on the walls. The faces were stern, heroic, and clearly unburdened by such bourgeois concepts as humour. He adjusted his tie
and joined the foreign guests lane, a grand name for a queue of 6 confused business people and one missionary who already looked like he regretted his choices in life.
An immigration officer took Bond's passport with a frown deep enough to count as a trench. "Mr. Hunt?" the man read, as if the letters had personally offended him. "Singapore." Bond smiled pleasantly. "That's what the passport claims, yes." The officer didn't appreciate the joke. North Korea, Bond reflected, wasn't big on banter. The man inspected every page as though he expected the Queen to leap out of the watermark and denounce Bond as a fraud. Finally, he stamped it with a thought that suggested passive aggression was a national sport.
"Welcome to the Democratic People's Republic of Korea," the officer intoned, sounding about as welcoming as a malfunctioning guillotine. A minder met him just beyond the baggage carousel, a thin man in a shiny suit that had clearly lost a long, bitter fight with static electricity. "I am Mr. Pak. I will be your guide," he announced. "We have prepared an itinerary." Bond smiled. "How thoughtful. I do enjoy an itinerary. It makes improvisation so much more fun." Pak blinked slowly. Humor flew past him like a stealth bomber. "We will show you our Yucha Tower, our Arch of Triumph, our excellent hotel. You will see we are a modern, thriving nation." "I can hardly wait," Bond replied.
The hotel was a monument to 1970s futurism, the kind of place that might once have been advertised as luxurious before the rest of the planet discovered taste. The revolving door creaked with each rotation, as though it carried the weight of too many broken dreams. In the lobby, enormous chandeliers hung from the ceiling like crystal UFOs. Everything else was beige. Pak checked him in the reception desk, speaking rapidly to the clerk in Korean.
Every so often, one of them would glance at Bond with the nervous look of people who'd been given something fragile and highly explosive. "Your room is on the 23rd floor, Park said. "You have view of city." "Splendid," Bond said. "I do like to keep an eye on things." Park either missed the implication or chose to ignore it.
His room was large, cold, and decorated in the brutalist style known as state functionary. Has no feelings. On the wall, a small television was already on, playing a documentary about tractors and smiling workers. Bond left in the way. Somewhere behind the clunky wooden wall unit, a listening device was almost certainly enjoying itself. He unpacked slowly. A few shirts, a dark suit, a slim metal case that would pass for a laptop but wasn't, and a bottle of scotch in a diplomatic bag, marked medical supplies. He sat on the edge of the bed, lit a cigarette, and watched the smoke curl towards the ceiling. His cover story was simple enough. Mr. Hunt, Singaporean arms broker with a reputation for discretion and a love of hard currencies.
He was here to discuss navigation chips and industrial-grade processors that just happened to be ideal for missile guidance systems, the kind of thing North Korea adored and the rest of the world frowned at. The hook had already been set. Now he just had to meet the woman who pulled the strings, Dr. Kim Sora.
The meeting place was not on the official itinerary. On paper, Bond spent the evening enjoying the cultural excellence performance at the Grand Theatre, a 3-hour spectacle of synchronized dancing, patriotic songs, and a man in a skin jacket shouting about harvests. In reality, he slipped out during the second act, traded the theatre's stale air for the bite of the Pyongyang nights, and took a side street where the lights were dimmer and the propaganda posters slightly more appealing. The jazz club was hidden beneath a nondescript building, its entrance marked only by a red door and the faint sound of saxophone playing something suspiciously Western. Inside it was smoky, low-ceilinged, and unexpectedly alive. A band stood on a tiny stage playing a soft melancholic tune that might once have been Autumn Leaves before being smuggled across borders in the head of a pianist with a more courage than sense. At the bar sat a scattering of men and women who looked like diplomats, fixers, and people who had seen enough secrets to know when to keep their mouths shut.
He felt her presence before he saw her. She sat at a small table near the back, perfectly poised, like a queen in exile, Dr. Kim Sora. Her hair was swept back in a smooth, severe style that highlighted the angle of her cheekbones. Her dress was simple and black, not quite fashionable but immaculate. Her eyes missed nothing. As he approached, she lifted a glass of something that pretended to be whiskey. "Mr. Hunt," she said, in an accent touched by Berlin and buried under Pyongyang. "You made it through customs. Congratulations. Many Westerners do not get this far without insulting someone's banner or haircut." "I try to save my insults for special occasions," Bond replied, taking the seat opposite. "Dr. Kim Sora, I presume, or should I say Professor?" "Doctor is fine," she said. "Professor belongs in Germany, along with decent coffee." Her gaze flickered over him quickly, clinically. "You do not look like an arms broker," she said. "You look like a man who's worn a uniform. Navy, I think. The posture is too straight. The shoes are too polished. Also, you ordered whiskey before I sat down. Real arms brokers wait to see who is paying." Bond smiled. "Perhaps I simply have faith in your generosity." "For now," she said. "Tell me, Mr. Hunt, what exactly do you think my country wants from you?" "You're working on something that needs precision," Bond said lightly. "Guidance systems, processing power, chips that don't melt if someone looks at them too hard." Sora's lips curved, but her eyes stayed flat. "You have good imagination," she said. "But imagination alone is not profitable." "In my line of work," Bond said, "it's essential." The band slid into a slower tune. Someone laughed too loudly at the bar. A glass clinked. Sora leaned in slightly. "If you are what you say you are, Mr. Hunt, then you will very soon meet people who can make you very rich." "And if I'm not what I say I am?" Bond asked. "Then you will very soon meet people who can make you very dead," she replied calmly. "Either way, the next few days will be interesting." She raised her glass. "To interesting days." Bond touched his drink to hers. "To darkness," he said. "The place where you see best, I'm told." This time, her smile did reach her eyes, just a fraction. "You listen well," she said.
Chapter 3. The Ghost Factory. Bond didn't sleep much that night. He lay on the stiff hotel bed, listening to the distant hum of generators and the occasional blast of patriotic music drifting up from somewhere below. Every hour or so, he would hear the soft scrap of footsteps in the corridor as someone checked doors that were always supposed to be locked. He had been in enemy capitals before: Moscow, Belgrade, various spots that had since changed flags and loyalties. Pyongyang was different. There was a peculiar kind of emptiness here, as though an entire city had been built for a parade, and no one had told the civilians that they were allowed to relax when the Martian was over. At 5 in the morning his phone rang. No number, of course. Yes? Bond answered.
Mr. Hunt, Sora's voice said, cool and alert. I hope you enjoyed the theatre. Our dancers worked very hard. They were very synchronized, Bond said. I'm sure somewhere in the world there's a Guinness record for most identical smiles. What can I do for you, Doctor? Today, she said, you will be taken on a tour of our more advanced facilities. The official explanation is that you are being shown our manufacturing capacity. The real explanation is that certain people wish to decide whether you are worth keeping alive. I'll wear something flattering then, Bond replied. Do. And Mr. Hunt, yes? Try not to be clever with Colonel Park. He does not appreciate sarcasm or people who breathe without permission. Sounds charming, Bond said. He is Unit 88, Sora replied. Our elite internal security. Imagine a man who has replaced sleep, humor, and hobbies with suspicion. That is Colonel Park.
The two of us will get on famously, Bond said and hung up. The Ryan Song industrial zone lay on the edge of Pyongyang like a bad idea someone had tried to hide under a concrete tarp. The drive there took 40 minutes in a military jeep whose suspension had given up in 1987. Pack sat beside Bond in the front, talking in enthusiastic monotone about the glory of self-reliance and the nation's excellent cement production. Bond nodded in all the right places and thought about hot showers, cold martinis, and countries where people were allowed to admit things weren't perfect. The closer they got, the more the city peeled away. The apartment blocks faded into low, functional buildings. Some smokestacks appeared, coughing out grey plumes into a sky that had long ago given up on being blue. And then he saw it. A high-walled compound of concrete and steel. Guard towers at each corner manned by soldiers in thick coats and thicker expressions. Cameras watching every angle, a gate designed to make you feel unwelcome even before it refused to open. Pack cleared his throat.
Ryong-song, he said proudly, industrial heart of our great nation.
I can hear it beating, Bond replied. At the gate, guards inspected his pass with more suspicion than most men reserved for loaded gun points at their own heads. Eventually, with a reluctant clang, the gates rolled open. Inside, the air smelled of metal, disinfectant, and something faintly chemical that wasn't quite anything Bond could name. He was introduced to Colonel Park in a small, elegantly bare office. Park was everything Sora had promised. Tall, in his 40s, with a sharp face that it looked like it had been carved from leftover granite.
His uniform was immaculate. His eyes were like small dark pits that had never once reflected laughter. Mr. Hunt, Park said without offering his hand, we are honored that you are considering cooperation with our republic. Bond smiled. Mutual benefit is always interesting, Colonel. You have needs. I have solutions. Park looked at him for a long, unpleasant moment. Foreigners think we are primitive, he said. They see our old cars, our old buildings. They do not see what lies beneath.
I try not to underestimate people who lock the gates this tightly, Bond replied. It was a risk, the small barb, but he needed to see how Park reacted to pressure. The Colonel's expression did not change. If anything, it became even more neutral. Come, he said.
We will show you our capacity.
The first part of the tour was designed to impress. Rows of machines, stamping metal parts, workers in overalls, moving with brisk efficiency, rooms full of computers that looked modern enough to frighten at least an average bureaucrat, everything just convincing enough to make a casual visitor nod and say, "Ah yes, industry." Bond played the part. He asked practical questions. He complimented their output. He allowed Park to boast about self-sufficiency. All the while he watched for doors they didn't open, corridors they passed without comment. He noticed a wing with heavier security, an extra keypad on the door, cameras at closer intervals. "What's in there?" Bond asked, in the curious tone of a businessman counting potential profits. "Maintenance," Park said smoothly. "Nothing of interest." Which meant, of course, everything of interest. It was almost an insult. How predictable they were. They broke for a late lunch in a Stark canteen where the food was bland, safe, and entirely forgettable, like the ideology that paid for it. Sora appeared halfway through the meal, sliding into the seat opposite Bond with a tray of soup and rice that she regarded with deep suspicion, as if it had personally offended her. "Enjoying the tour?" she asked lightly. "It's very impressive," Bond said. "I practically liked the part where I didn't see anything that mattered." Park, sitting on table over, was deep in conversation with another officer, but Bond knew better than to assume the man wasn't listening. Sora stirred her soup lazily. "There are 2 hours here. The one you are seen to be given, and the one you will take for yourself." Bond looked at her. "And which tour am I on this afternoon?" Her eyes flicked briefly towards the heavy security wing he'd noticed earlier. "That depends," she said, "on how good you are at not being where you're supposed to be." He finished his rice and smiled. "I've always been very gifted at that." That evening, under cover of a scheduled equipment briefing, Bond slipped away.
He moved through a seam of shadow where one camera's arc ended and another's began, a blind spot so small it could only have been designed by a human being who understood that even machines liked a moment off. He palmed a small bypass device onto a keypad and waited. The lock hummed, hesitated, then clicked open with a reluctant sigh.
The corridor beyond felt different, colder, quieter. The fluorescent lights hummed like nervous insects. Each door he passed had a designation code instead of a name: C4B9HEX/12. No windows, no sound. Then he heard it, a faint rhythmic beep, the slow exhale of ventilators, the strangled whisper of someone not quite asleep. He opened the door and stepped into the ghost factory. The room was long and white and deeply wrong. Rows of beds lined the walls, each occupied by a figure draped in hospital sheets, men and women with shaved heads.
Electrodes taped to their temples, thin tubes snaking into their veins. Their eyes were open but unfocused, somewhere between waking and a chemical dream. Bond moved closer, scanning the hastily translated readouts on the nearby monitors. Neural mapping, synaptic response curves, behavioral pattern overlays. He wasn't a scientist, but he had seen enough strange things in enough underground labs to recognize the tone.
They weren't treating these people, they were recording them. At the far end of the room, in a glass cylinder, stood something that wasn't yet a person and wasn't quite a machine. A humanoid frame, artificial muscle fibers coiled under synthetic skin, an artificial chest rising and falling too regular, too perfect.
The face was still forming, a mask in progress, but the bones, the structure, were horribly familiar. Bond felt a cold little line of ice slide down his spine. He had seen this face in newspapers, on broadcasts, on posters glaring down at him in the airport with benevolent disdain. It was the supreme leader, or at least it was going to be, a mechanical double, a clone, an undead puppet to walk and talk and smile on behalf of a regime that didn't trust even its own mortality. Bond stared at it, and for once in his life found himself almost speechless.
Almost. "I always knew politicians were replaceable," he muttered, "but this seems a bit literal." That was when a door behind him was opened. "Clever," a voice said, but not clever enough. It was Sora. and this time the gun in her hand was very, very real. Chapter 4. The bathroom incident. She held the pistol in both hands, arms steady, stance solid. Bond turned slowly, raising his hands just enough to show cooperation without admitting defeat.
"I suppose," he said mildly, "this isn't the official tour."
Her face was unreadable. "You were warned not to be where you are not supposed to be, Mr. Hunt," she said. "You should have listened." "Everyone keeps telling me that," Bond replied. "I really must start keeping a list." For a long moment, they simply looked at each other among the softly beeping machines. He could see the conflict in her eyes. No doubt, not exactly, but fatigue. The weariness of a woman who had bargained with the devil so often she no longer remembered what the original price had been. Finally, she sighed. "I knew you weren't an arms broker," she said.
Bond cocked his head. What gave me away? The suit? The tie? The fact I tipped the barman properly?
"No," she said. "It was the way you watched the room. Arms brokers look at pockets and watches. You look at exits and people's hands." She gestured at the figure in the glass cylinder.
"Now you know," she said. "My country's latest miracle. What will you do with that knowledge, Mr. whatever your real name is?" Bond shrugged lightly. "Have an existential crisis," he said. "Then stop it, if I can." A corner of her mouth twitched. "I thought as much," she murmured.
Very slowly, with the care of someone disarming her own consciousness, she lowered the gun. Then she reached into her lab coat, pulled out a small data drive and tossed it to him. Bond caught it one-handed. "What is this?" he asked. "Everything," she said simply. "Design files, command codes, the location of auxiliary labs, enough to cripple the project, if you understand what you're looking at. And you're giving this to a man you believe is a spy," Bond said. "I'm giving it to a man who looked at that thing." She nodded at the half-born double in the tank and didn't smile. For a brief moment there was a quiet, delicate balance between them. Then the alarms began to scream. What happened next was chaos, choreographed by fear and training. Gas poured into the corridor outside, red lights flashed. Somewhere Colonel Park was shouting orders in clipped, furious Korean. Bond grabbed Sora's wrist. "This way," he snapped. They ran down the corridor, past rooms full of humming machines and frozen faces,
through a side door that led to a stairwell which clearly hadn't been part of the official plan.
He could hear Park's boots ringing on metal somewhere above them. 2 floors down, they burst through another door into a loading area. Trucks, crates, a smell of exhaust and disinfectant. "Over there," Sora gasped, pointing to a narrow corridor leading away from the main bustle. "Service passage. It leads to the outer compound." They sprinted along the passage, feet pounding. Bond felt the weight of the drive in his pocket like a second heart. At the end of the corridor was a door marked with a simple icon, a figure standing, and another sitting. "A restroom." "Yes," Bond said. "Perfect. When being chased by elite security forces, always stop for a comfort break. Why not also brush our teeth while we're at it?" Sora shook her head. "There's a window," she said. "Leads to the maintenance yard. From there you can..." The door swung open before she finished. Colonel Park filled the doorway, flanked by 2 men. "Really?" he said, his voice like a knife, drawn slowly from a sheath. "A toilet, Dr. Kim? Is this what Western films have taught you about escape?" One of the men behind him immediately grabbed Bond, wrenching his arms behind his back. The other seized Sora. Bond struggled, but the hold was good, professional.
He recognized the grip of someone who had been taught precisely where to apply pain to make resistance pointless. Park stepped in, shutting the door behind him. The bathroom was small, clean, and suddenly felt much too full. A sink, a mirror, a single toilet with a gleaming porcelain bowl. It occurred to Bond, not for the first time in his life, that there were worse places to die. but not many less dignified. Park studied him.
"You disappoint me, Mr. Hunt," he said softly. "You were convincing, almost charming, but in my line of work, charming is just another word for lying." Bond smiled thinly. "In my line of work, too," he said. "We should start a club." Park's gaze hardened lazily. "You will tell me who you are," he said. "Who sent you? What you've seen, or I will make this room your grave. You understand?" Bond glanced at the sparkling white toilet. "Bit cramped for a grave," he said, "though I suppose it's what one might call efficient." Park nodded to the guard holding Bond. The other guard let go of Sora, stepped forward, and with frighteningly practiced ease grabbed Bond by the back of the neck and the belt. He drove Bond's head down towards the toilet. Porcelain filled Bond's vision, cold, smooth, utterly uncompromising. Well, Bond thought, this is a new law, even for me. His face hit the water. It was shockingly cold. The world became a roar of bubbles and distant shouting.
The porcelain rim pressed into his forehead like an accusing finger. He held his breath and waited. Above, he could hear Park speak.
"Hold him there," the colonel said calmly. "Long enough to encourage cooperation. Not long enough to lose him permanently. Not yet." The grip on Bond's neck tightened. He counted slowly in his head. 1, 2, 3. On 5 he twisted. It was a dirty move. Born of panic and training, he jerked his head sideways, driving the edge of his skull into the guard's forearm. At the same time, he shifted his weight, pushing back with his shoulders. The guard swore, grip loosening for a half a second. Half a second was all Bond ever needed. He tore his head up from the bowl, gasping water streaming down his face, with his arm still pinned behind him by the first guard. He launched himself backward, slamming his full weight into the man's chest. They crashed into the cubicle wall. Something in the guard's ribs made a loud, unpleasant noise. The second guard lunged forward to help, and in that movement Sora acted. She snatched the colonel's sidearms from the holster with surprising speed and jammed it towards the throat. No one moved for a heartbeat.
Water dripped from Bond's hair onto the floor with an indecorous plink, plink, plink.
Park's eyes burned into Sora. "You will not shoot," he said. "You are loyal." "I'm tired," she said softly, "and those are not the same thing." Bond slammed the heel down onto the instep of a man behind him, then twisted his arm sharply. The guard yelped and let go. In 2 strides, Bond was beside Sora, taking the gun from her and leveling up at Park.
"That's better," he said, still breathing hard. "I prefer a more even distribution of firearms."
The second guard, clutching his side, glared at him. "You will not escape," Park said. "This is nowhere to go," Bond smiled.
"Let's test that theory, shall we?" He moved quickly, shoving Park and the guards back against the wall. He didn't bother killing them. Not here. Not in this ridiculous little room. If he died, he'd rather it not be, with his last view on Earth being a toilet cistern. He grabbed Sora's hand. "Window?" he snapped.
She nodded towards the far end of the bathroom, where a small frosted pane of glass sat above head height. "Of course," Bond muttered, "because nothing says subtle escape route like gymnastics." He jumped onto the closed lid of the toilet, which he felt had already played far too big a role in the evening, braced a shoulder under the window frame and shoved. The glass gave way with a creak, showering the maintenance yard outside with small, guilty shards. Cold air hit him like a slap. He turned back to Sora, offering a hand. "Ladies first," he said. "For once," she said dryly, and climbed up. Park shouted something behind them, orders, threats, it didn't matter. The guards scrambled to regain control. Bond hauled himself through the gap after Sora's skin catching on the rough concrete. They landed in the maintenance yard in an ungainly tangle of limbs and indignation. Somewhere an alarm began to wave. Bond pulled Sora to her feet. "Well," he panted, "I think we've outstayed our welcome."
"That was a terrible escape," she said, brushing dust from her coat. "Very loud, very messy." "Yes," Bond replied, "but quite memorable." Behind them, in the white-tiled bathroom, Colonel Park glared at the broken window. "I hate toilets," he said quietly, while lighting a surprisingly dry cigarette. Chapter 5, Ice and Fire.
The maintenance yard behind Rhinesong Complex was the kind of place only a bureaucrat could love. Endless grey concrete, stacked crates marked with ominous stencils, and a forklift that looked like it believed in reincarnation and was hoping to return as something less overworked. Bond and Sora darted behind a metal container as the alarms rose to an unholy pitch. Searchlights snapped on, slicing through the dusk like angry divine judgment. "Lovely," Bond muttered. "They've switched to dramatic lightning. How theatrical of them." Sora gave him a look that suggested she hadn't time for his jokes, but appreciated them anyway. "We'll be seen if we stay here," she whispered. "Yes, but if we move, we'll be seen faster," Bond replied. "It's a subtle difference, but an important one." Boots thundered across the yard behind them. Colonel Park's voice barked commands in a tone that could sterilize metal. Sarah pointed towards the far wall. "There's a drainage culvert near the northeast corner. It leads under the outer fence." Bond looked. Sure enough, a square mouth of darkness, half buried under snow, and a generous serving of North Korean rubbish. "Excellent," he said. "An escape route with added tetanus." "Move," Sora hissed. They sprinted. A spotlight swept across the yard, catching the heel of Bond's shoe as he dove behind the next crate. Gunfire cracked. Concrete exploded near the elbow. "Oh, perfect," Bond said.
"They're welcoming us with musket fire."
Sora slid into the culvert first, disappearing into a shadow with a splash. Bond followed, dropping into knee-deep freezing water that made him deeply reconsider his career choices. The metal walls echoed every sound. The air smelled like a chemical experiment that had given up halfway. "Remind me," Bond muttered, "to pick holiday destinations with fewer sewage tunnels." Sora shushed him. "Keep moving." Behind them, flashlight lit the culvert entrance. A familiar voice echoed. "Colonel Park." He loomed in the opening, framed by light like a particularly malevolent snowman. "You cannot hide," Park called. "Your choices are surrender or drowning in filth."
Bond gave him a cheerful wave and vanished deeper into the tunnel.
They emerged on the far side of the compound, soaked, frozen, and smelling faintly of industrial detergent. Ahead lay open snowfields, a line of forest, and the distant silhouette of mountains. Beyond the mountains, the Yellow River. Beyond the river, China. Beyond China, hopefully a warm bath and a drink. Sora hugged herself against the cold. "We must reach higher grounds. There are old patrol paths." "Marvelous," Bond said.
"I do love a leisurely mountain trek whilst being hunted." They trudged into the snow.
The wind whipped across the open ground with the enthusiasm of a hairdryer from hell. Bond pulled his collar tight and glanced behind him every few steps. "Do you always do that?" Sora asked. "Yes," Bond said. "It's how I stay alive and annoy my enemies." They reached a ridge, looking a valley glazed with pale moonlight. On the far side, faint golden light glimmered, China in the distance waving politely. They were halfway down when Bond froze. Engines, distant, approaching fast, snowmobiles. He dragged Sora behind a large boulder just as two headlights slashed across the slope. Rifles cracked, snow erupted near their feet. "We can't outrun them," Bond said. "We need a distraction." Sora reached into her coat and pulled out a metallic cube blinking with tiny lights. "You said you enjoy improvisation," Bond started. "Oh, please tell me that is the self-destruct device. It activates the failsafe. Your drive has the command codes. How big's the explosion?" Bond asked. She hesitated. Moderately survivable." Bond grinned. "My favorite kind." He connected the cube to the drive in his coat. The lights on both devices began flashing rapidly. The snowmobile swooped down towards them, engine snarling.
Bond hurled the device as hard as he could up the slope. "Run!" he shouted. They ran, and then the world behind them exploded.
It was not a dignified explosion. It was a furious dragon's roar, a storm of fire and pressure that slapped Bond off his feet like an offended deity. He hit the ground face first, skidding several meters until he came to rest against a rock. Sora landed behind him with a grunt that translated roughly to, "This is not how my day was supposed to go." Bond spat snow from his mouth. "Moderately survivable," he wheezed. "For certain values of the word." Sora looked up the mountain. The Roy Song facility was burning, orange flames licking the night sky, smoke rising like a torn curtain. The explosion had triggered cascading self-destruct systems. The entire project was incinerating itself. Dozens of years of illicit research dying in one glorious chain reaction. Sora whispered. "It's over. For now," Bond corrected. They lay beside each other in the snow, freezing but alive, watching the sky burn. "Well," Bond said finally, "I believe that concludes our tour." Chapter 6. London Debrief. 3 days later, James Bond walked through the polished marble lobby of MI6 headquarters, looking annoyingly healthy for a man who had recently outrun explosions, snowmobiles, and a toilet assassination attempt. He wore a tailored charcoal suit, freshly shaved, hair neat. The picture of British professionalism, if one ignored the faint bruise on his jaw and the lingering scent of North Korean disinfectant clinging to his coat. The receptionist, the same bleary-eyed man who always looked like he survived of instant coffee and regret, blinked at him. "Morning, sir," he said. "Morning," Bond replied cheerfully, as though he hadn't spent the week crawling through communist plumbing systems. Upstairs, M's office door opened with its usual groan, a sound halfway between ancient wood and eternal disappointment. M stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back, staring out at the Thames with the grim air of a man expecting bad news and fully prepared to blame Bond for all of it. Without turning, M said, "Sit down, 007. Bond sat. The chair was stiff enough to qualify as a medieval torture device. He suspected it was chosen solely to discourage lengthy explanations. M finally turned around. "You've caused quite a disturbance." Bond arched an eyebrow. "You'll have to be more specific." M threw a folder into the desk. It landed with a thud that suggested international scandal. "Half a mountain exploded," M said. "Half a mountain, Bond." "In my defense," Bond replied, "it was a very unfriendly mountain."
M stared at him with the weary contempt of a man who had long ago given up expecting sanity. Bond lit a cigarette.
"The Americans are livid," he continued. "The South Koreans are nervous. The North Koreans naturally deny everything. According to them, the blast was caused by a celebratory agricultural accident." Bond frowned. "Agricultural?" "Apparently someone dropped a particularly patriotic pumpkin." Bond nodded. "Sounds entirely plausible." M pinched the bridge of his nose. "It isn't funny, Bond." "It was a little funny, sir," Bond said. M didn't agree. He opened the folder. Inside were printouts of intercepted communications, satellite photographs of scorched earth, and schematics Bond recognized from Sora's stolen drive. "Your intelligence was accurate," M said, voice low. The Roy Song complex housed a cloning and cybernetic augmentation project. They were attempting to create mechanical doubles of the leadership. "Insurance policies?" Bond said. "A backup dictator for rainy days?" "Don't joke!" M snapped. "This is serious. Very serious, horrifying even." Bond sighed. "That's why I blew it up." "Yes," M said. "And what a splendid job you did of that. MI6 now has the dubious honor of being responsible for the loudest bang North Korea has suffered since the Cold War." He slumped the folder shut. "Let's talk about Dr. Kim Sora."
Bond's expression cooled slightly.
"What about her?"
M studied him carefully.
"Your report says she stayed behind." "She chose to," Bond said. "She said she needed to clean up the mess from the inside." "And you left her there." Bond met M's eyes with the steady calm of a man who had lived through enough to know when not to argue. "She made her choice," he said simply. Said M. "You seem to take that rather personally." "I don't take anything personally," Bond said. M gave him a look that said, "You're full of it," but he didn't pursue it. Instead, he opened another file and placed it in front of Bond. "Your actions destroyed Project Kolyma," M said. "Every backup facility, every data conduit, every synthetic cell cluster. You've dismantled an entire clandestine scientific program with one act." Bond nodded. "I've always liked efficiency," M sighed. "Unfortunately, the Foreign Office would like a word." Bond blinked. "Why?" "They believe you have escalated tensions." Bond spread his hands. "I only escalated the part that was trying to build cyborg dictators."
M rubbed his face with both hands.
"The International signed for, I want to retire but the universe won't let me." "Bond," he said quietly, "why do these things always happen when I send you abroad?" "It's a gift." M closed the folder with a decisive snap. "You're on leave," he said. "Immediately. Preferably somewhere warm, somewhere without explosive secret police or toilets." Bond stood. "I'll try," he said, "but life is full of surprises." M gave a weary, reluctant nod. "Yes," he said, "and unfortunately they usually follow you." Bond turned to leave. "Oh, and 007, M added. Bond paused. "Do you require medical leave after the toilet incident?" Bond winced. "Please, sir, let's never speak of that again." M nodded soberly. "Agreed." Bond left the office with his usual smooth stride, already thinking about beaches, martinis, and the lovely absence of Colonel Park. Chapter 7. Epilogue. The Man Who Watched the Waves. A week later, James Bond sat on a quiet beach in the South Pacific, a place so idyllic it made postcards feel insecure. The sun hung lazy in the sky. The ocean rolled in gentle, glittering waves. The palm trees swayed with the slow, smug confidence of things that had never heard of North Korea. Bond sat in a low wooden deck chair, ankles crossed, wearing sunglasses, the coast slightly less than a small used car.
A tall drink rested in his hand, perfectly cold, perfectly mixed, the nearest thing to therapy MI6 ever provided. He exhaled long and slow. It was the first time in days he didn't feel the phantom cold of Korean snow under his skin, or the faint sense of dread that comes from having your head held in a porcelain bowl by disgruntled communists.
A radio sat on a side table, murmuring waves in the background. Reports indicate a minor industrial accident in the DPRK. Officials deny foreign involvement. American intelligence sources express concern. The cause is believed to be faulty machinery. Bond smiled. Yes, he thought. Faulty machinery. That kind that explodes when someone drops a secret self-destruct cube into it. He took a sip of his drink and let the warmth spread through him. The ocean air smelled of salt and distant adventure, not burnt wiring or disinfectant. The sand was warm, not freezing. The only nearby surveillance was a small curious crab,
whose loyalties were unclear but probably harmless.
For now, he thought of Sora, her voice drifting through the smoke and snow. Her voice calm, intelligent, sharper than any weapon he'd carried. She had chosen to stay in North Korea, chosen duty, guilt, redemption, whatever name she'd given it. Bond respected that, but he also knew what it meant.
People like her rarely got happy endings. He lit another cigarette as his mind wandered deeper. He raised his glass quietly in her direction, wherever she was. To impossible women, he murmured, and improbable escapes. He thought of Colonel Park, a man built entirely out of spite, discipline, and antiseptic.
Bond wondered if Park had survived the explosion.
The Colonel seemed like the kind of man who could survive a direct asteroid impact just to file a strongly worded complaint afterwards. If he was still alive, Bond expected he was somewhere shouting at subordinates about proper toilet-based interrogation technique and vowing revenge.
That was fine. Bond was used to men vowing revenge. Most of them ended up dead, confused, or in therapy. He thought of Pyongyang, the harsh lights, the cold nights, the jazz bar where forbidden music played like whispered rebellion. He wondered whether the pianist was still playing. He hoped so.
A waiter approached, a young man in a crisp shirt and the kind of smile Bond wished more world leaders had. "Another drink, sir?" Bond looked at the fading sun, at the warm golden spill of light across the sea, and nodded. "Yes," he said. "And make it cold. Very cold." The waiter nodded and left.
Bond leaned back, stretching his legs, letting the waves whisper their endless secrets. He allowed himself to relax, truly relax, a thing he rarely did and only ever in places where the horizon felt friendly. His phone buzzed faintly. A message. One word. Rest. M. Bond chuckled. "I'll try," he said aloud. And for the first time in a long while he actually meant it. The sun dipped a little lower. The drink arrived. The tide rolled in, soft and steady. James Bond closed his eye. Behind them lay North Korea. Danger, madness, snow, lavatories, and explosions. Ahead of them lay warmth, rest, and a temporary sense of peace. For now. But the world always calls him back eventually. And when it did, he would be ready. Because he was Bond. James Bond. Agent 007 with a license to kill. And the waves kept watching, whispering his name as the sky turned to gold. Thank you so much for listening to my podcast. I was trying to read the podcast like Robert Whitfield. The first audio book I listened to James Bond novels were read by Robert Whitfield. I tried to imitate him.